Horns of the Limit, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. On this episode of Horns, we listen into a conversation by Brigadier General retired Kimberly Field, a professor of practice and Executive Director of the Albritton Center for Grand Strategy at Texas A&M University. General Field discusses the notion of grand strategy in the context of alliance relationships. Specifically, she draws on her experience serving as a U.S. representative at the UN and also as a general officer deployed to Afghanistan as part of the NATO alliance to discuss the role that allies play in supporting and enabling U.S. grand strategic vision. Let's listen in.
Thank you, Paul. Today, Paul asked me to talk about pursuing national policy in a multinational environment, in a coalition, in our collective security arrangements, our alliances, things like that. So, as I want to do as both the executive director of the Albritton Center for Grand Strategy and it is in my nature, it is to connect that to the bigger context. Right? So recently, Professor Lisa Cobbs and I wrote a piece in the New York Times, an op-ed in the New York Times, talking about the need for grand strategy. And it had to do with it was prompted by the killing of General Soleimani. And so we asked questions of why did we do that? What's at stake? It wasn't being critical, taking a position one way or the other. It was just, let's be clear about what interests are at stake and what challenges our interests. Which led us then to say, well, what then are we connected into? What is our writ in the world to take this strike? How does our Middle East policy fit in the grander idea of our writ, our role in the world, right? Grand strategy. That's what grand strategy is, right? It's not better than great strategy. You know, people, it's an actual term. It is not a field of study necessarily, an academic discipline, but it is a term used in international relations and foreign policy. We posited that there were three, there are more, but that there are three general models of grand strategy that we could and should be considering right now. We've only had two, really, in our history. It started with the Founding Fathers and George Washington when he said we shall have no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, and we should resist entangling alliances. And we kept to that, largely until after World War II. Well, we got into World War, and then after World War II with the Truman Doctrine that said we needed to not just make sure that there was stability in the world in Europe and Japan, but we also needed to push back on communist ideology wherever it popped up. We spread ourselves all over the world. We entered into many, many different alliances and collective security arrangements. In doing so, did a lot of good. We did exactly what President Truman felt we should do. After that, however, we had the end of the Cold War, right? The environment changed. And we had a situation where we still had this wonderful military. Do you remember, does anybody remember Madeleine Albright's comment, right? Yes, right, when she said when she was ambassador to the United Nations, and she said to General Colin Powell, what good is this big military you're always talking about, this wonderful military you're always talking about, if you don't want to use it? And this is when she was saying, hey, Balkans, it's our responsibility. It's in Europe, right? And he said, hey, I don't get this. This isn't exactly what we're supposed to be doing here. So after that, and then we had the other, it wasn't communism anymore, it was terrorism, right? Which we're still a little bit in the throes of that, of combating it wherever it pops up. We leading the world in doing that, largely because it was our country who was hit, right? But there's a couple of things happening now that have us take a look at things like NATO, things about our alliances in East Asia. Those things are our debt, $23 trillion of debt we have. We have to make annual payments on interest on those. So what are we not being able to buy if we have to make those payments? We kind of forget about our debt. The rise of China. China's going to rise. I'm not sure we have a lot to say about it. And frankly, it's probably only their will, their desire to do more around the world that stops them from doing what they want to do too, just like us. Right? Is that going to be forever and ever? Maybe. Who knows? Right? It's a big question mark. And then thirdly, I think we have seen the limits of the utility of military force. I think we've seen that in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Yemen, all over the place. We've seen the limits. It's done some good. I'm not saying we have. ISIS, head is down. Al-Qaeda is not around as much anymore. We can talk about that later. Anyway, the environment has changed. So we posited these three options and it said city on a hill. We put for public consumption. You all are more informed than that probably. City on a hill, generally meaning we would make decisions based on that which best strengthens our democracy. The idea being that if we are a shining light and democracy works so well in all the social services it provides, that will spread democracy around the world, and democracies don't fight. Okay. Second one would be like a fortress, right? Fortress America that would make all its decisions through the lens of what strengthens our position vis-a-vis China. China is the big strategic question of this century, probably. We have some say in how we respond to it. Our third option that we presented was to keep doing what we're doing largely, except for do not use force unless it is sanctioned by the United Nations Security Council, unless it is deemed legitimate by others beyond ourselves. Right? But keep doing what we're doing. The idea that we have to stay in all these alliances, it's in our best interest to pursue our national policies within these alliances. Because we get stability in East Asia for now. We get stability in Europe. It's an environment conducive to trade and economic prosperity. And if we don't do it, there will be a vacuum. And geopolitics abhors a vacuum, right? So if we pull out of the Middle East, for example, who might step in? Not Russia. Okay, then I would ask the question, who cares? Well, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe we should care. Maybe we shouldn't care. What happens if Russia then steps in and influences OPEC? Aren't we energy independent? Of course, it's a global commodity. So, there's all of these things that I think we really need to unpack when we talk about our security arrangements. Anyway, the foreign policy and the word of the year and of the decade is maybe restraint. We did not use restraint in our article. The Clements Center, Paul ran a conference on restraint. We've had one recently. Restraint, 2 levels. For some, it means we have to have alternatives to this idea that the United States should continue to be the security provider to the world. Okay. Others, the tent could be bigger than that, though. Others could say that restraint is really, let's just use different instruments of power, not just the military everywhere. Right? So there's an interesting conversation going on now. There's academic institutions and institutions in Washington that are being funded to put forward options called restraint. My organization is one of them. I'm personally not necessarily a restrainer, but we were funded in part, not completely, in order to provide alternatives to primacy, right? So I think that this conversation is actually, in fact, probably overdue. This conversation about which alliances, which collective security arrangements, right? But I think that in order to avoid talking past each other in having this conversation, I think we need to do 2 things. We need to try to agree on certain facts and assumptions, right? Fact, we have this debt. Assumption, what assumption? It is going to negatively impact our ability to provide for our national security. Maybe, right? We at least need to have the conversation, right? With economists in the room, with the decision makers in the room. Like in the military, we're used to, you make assumptions to continue to strategize, to continue to plan, and you always have the commander in the room when you're discussing assumptions about the future. Right? We need to do that. I think, secondly, we really need to get beyond the sort of war of ideas, isolationism versus world policemen, and get to how. How, if in fact we wanted to limit our contributions, limit our engagement, or change our contribution, what does that look like? Right? Paul and I were talking last night, we really need like a wargaming capability. If we want to make changes, what happens? Right? We really need to get past that, this idea of just talking about ideas and theory. So which really kind of brings me, and so there's sort of a subset of questions when you talk about that, and one of them is alliances and multinational operations and the ability of us to pursue our national policy in that environment. And I just want to make 3 points about that. First, I'd say it is possible to pursue, in almost all situations, to pursue our national policy in a coalition or a multinational setting. Secondly, and it's related, sometimes it shouldn't matter if we don't always get our way, because typically these alliances and arrangements, defense agreements, have a bigger purpose than just the specific issue at hand. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. And thirdly, they are a pain in the neck. Operating inside these coalitions is a real pain. And anybody who has been a civilian deployed inside one or in uniform can give you real details, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so first, and we're still the most powerful country in the world. There's no, and part of it is our desire to be, right? China doesn't want to do what we do. We still want to. It's really based on our ability to actually wield our power. So we sometimes look boorish. These things aren't always efficient, but they kind of work. We tend to get our way, and that is in part because power differentials are reflected. And I hope this isn't too esoteric or academic, but if you think back to the League of Nations, why it failed, and the United Nations, why it exists, right? It's built in, this power differential. Some states are more powerful than others, right? It's built in. So it gives, so this veto in the United Nations Security Council, and the Security Council only seizes issues of peace and security, important ones, right? The smaller things, or the development things, are in the General Assembly. So when I worked at the UN as a major, we worked on this set of reforms called the Brahimi Peacekeeping Report. Maybe some of you know what that's all about. It was a fairly ambitious attempt to reform the way the United Nations would conduct peacekeeping, peace enforcement, peace building operations, the things we as a country don't want to do. We want them done. We don't want genocide or something that could lead to it in Africa. We want stability around the world because our member states are interested in it as well. And we signed up to this collective security arrangement. And I think there's an important distinction to be made. The United Nations is a collective security arrangement, meaning it's inward facing. We all agree not to attack each other. Right? Alliances are different. They're external facing. They typically have an enemy, stated or unstated, in mind. Right? NATO, right? Russia. We wonder why Russia gets their back up, because it stood up as an alliance oriented externally to an enemy. Right? They can't just chuck that away because we say, "Oh, don't worry about us. We're no threat to you." Right? Same thing in East Asia. Right, we have a series of them largely geared toward communist China, North Korea, externally oriented. And I think it's important as we reconsider these things and how well they work and what they're doing for us. Anyway, the Brahimi report, it did work for us. It did it did recommend and in fact implement a series of reforms like enhancing rapid deployment, standby rosters, improving the capability of UN civilian police. All of these things did happen in our interests. I participated. I was the United States representative in working out these things that we were going to make better inside the UN. Okay, as we still don't participate and we don't want to. And I can't see us being a troop contributing country anytime in the near future. I just can't see it, and that's okay. When I was doing this, was in the year 2000, we were paying our bills because it was in our interest to do so. If we look at alliances and defense security partnerships, in East Asia, we have a lot of them. We have quite a few of them. We have Australia, Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and then different types with Taiwan and Singapore. We've made agreements with all these countries that we will come to their defense under certain circumstances. Taiwan and Singapore slightly different, and they've changed over time. So these alliances that were started in the 1950s don't look exactly the same as they look now. So my point here is that they do change all the time. They work for us. And usually we can make them work for us. So Afghanistan, this is what I'm most familiar with. I have 4 tours to Afghanistan. The most recent I just left in May. We have 2 missions in Afghanistan now. I don't know if everybody knows that. We have the NATO operation, Operation Resolute Support, and we have another one, Operation Freedom Sentinel. They have different authorities, different funding streams. Some forces are allocated differently. Some are under the big umbrella of the NATO mission. But we have 2, and it largely works for us. In Operation Freedom Sentinel, we provide the counterterrorism capability in Afghanistan. We do all the shooting and all the killing in Afghanistan, both Taliban and ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Our partners, our NATO partners, that mission has changed. All they do is train, advise, and assist. And they set up air bases. So we have Germany in the north, in Mazar-e-Sharif, that keeps an air base open so the national government can project its power in partnership with us in the north. The Italians are in the west. They will not fire their weapons except in self-defense. So, okay, that's what we agreed as an alliance. So we do it. And some people say, why are we doing all the killing? Doesn't anybody else care about terrorism? Well, it's an interesting question to ask. Why don't they? Afghanistan is closer to Europe than it is to us. Why don't they? I don't know. But they're there. Our partners in NATO are there and just renewed their commitment to 2024 last summer because we're there. And the second we leave, they will leave. It will be the second we leave. Actually, it'll be the second before we leave. They will be gone, right? It's fine. It's fine. They're only there for us. They're only there for the sake of the alliance. Which leads me to the second point, really, is that these things are bigger than NATO is bigger than Afghanistan, right? And there's been endless conversations about should it expand, what should it do, what about out-of-area operations, why doing transnational threat missions like piracy and migration and terrorism, right? All over the world. They're in Iraq. Some have written that actually NATO is the only operational arm that the UN has. Maybe, right? Which makes it look a bit more like a collective security arrangement now. So you could see a case where NATO, under a UN sanction with Russia by our side, could be doing something in the world, right? All in our own interest. Bigger purposes, right? In East Asia, we wanted to have these partnerships with the countries I mentioned because we didn't want them taking provocative actions. We have to come to their rescue at some point. So we provide an assurance. We're here for you. Don't do anything crazy, right? Also gave us ability to negotiate diplomatic solutions because we had the credibility. We had some stake in it, some skin in the game, right? So Cambodia, 1951. We also, our very presence there, we think, creates stability. Others would disagree. Some say our presence creates turmoil. In the Middle East, get out of the Middle East, it might be better off. Not sure. We just war game all these things. With these alliances, some will say, hey, listen, NATO, it's a juice just is not worth the squeeze. Right? Which leads me to my third point. It's really a pain to operate in a NATO environment in a way. Now, remember, I just said, though, we need that base in the north. We don't have the manpower to do it. We don't want to put more troops in there. We need that base in the west with the Italians that are taking care of that, right? But day-to-day operations is a pain. General Craddock, when he left as SAC here, he said, you need to, speaking about NATO, when he was free to speak as a civilian, he said, you need to reach consensus on whether to serve red sauce or white sauce on the pasta. Consensus in garnering international support and legitimacy is one thing. But for routine alliance business, right, it's everything. It's a big conversation. Easier said than done. NATO would need to reach consensus on a decision to no longer need to reach consensus. It's time to change the MO. Let's always remember Churchill, who said, the only thing worse than fighting a war with allies is fighting a war without them. Right? Same old conversation, still having today. Burden sharing. Sometimes burden sharing actually becomes a conversation about body bags, to be pretty crass. Right? Who's dying there? Now, let's not forget, we lost, 2,400 soldiers in Afghanistan. Our NATO partners all together, and we had 29 NATO partners and then 40-something others. Japan was there, right, in Afghanistan. We still have about 30 countries, not just NATO countries from all over the world. We still have them in Afghanistan. They've sacrificed to the tune of over 1,000, right? So, but that becomes a conversation, not just money, but lives. So what that leads to, in many cases in our partners, is this thing called caveats. Have you heard of national caveats? Maybe where countries say, we're in, but we need to not do certain things because we're going to lose the support of our populations if we do. So national caveats can be things like the Germans in the north. They could not, this is when they were still in ISAF, which was it was a shooting mission for everybody. They could not fly their helicopter to pick up their wounded if they had not reconned the LZ, landing zone. Okay, so we would do it. We would have medevac birds in the north, and we would go pick up the German soldiers. But the German soldiers themselves, it did not make them happy at all. They would beg to get on our birds so they could treat their own, right? But it's kind of like the UN Security Council veto, right? It's giving states an option to say not that thing, but I'm still in this arrangement. Same thing, really, with national caveats. Right? It lets countries still participate with having to make a binary thing of we're out. Right? We're out because we'll lose the support of our population. That largely has to do with what kind of parliamentary system, whether it's more of a consensus or a primary decision maker, and a lot to do with the individuals in power. But it's a real thing. There's been many, many conferences, mostly Americans, asking our NATO partners to please lift your caveats. Other caveats could be we will not cross from one province to another. So our soldiers get frustrated at the highest level. They get really frustrated with this. Say, what good are these guys? Right? ISAF. Soldiers would say, I saw an American fight. ISAF. Wow, that's terrible. Right? That would be the name of it, right? So I always try to squash that. Say, listen, they're here. This is the only way they can be here. Right? They operate differently than we do. My boss, when I just left Afghanistan, frankly, Paul was saying that I have a propensity to have a big mouth. That's really what he was saying. And I do. Right? So he had actually hired me to be his designated red teamer to tell him where things weren't going right, where maybe he was going the wrong way. He was a special operator, and he was very conscious of not following in General McChrystal's footsteps and like becoming a little clique. So that's why he hired me, basically. But I would have to remind him all the time, you've got to spend more time with NATO. You know, we want those two bases. We need the Romanians to be providing perimeter security at Kandahar Air Base. We need this stuff. You've got to spend more time with them. He'd be frustrated because there was a lot of talk. He didn't have time to always share information with his deputy, who's always going to be a coalition partner. Chief of staff, right now, is always going to be a German. Just didn't have time. He felt like he didn't have time for all the talk, which I understood. But I think you really got to make time. You got to make time. Finally, some of it, we think in order to achieve our own national policy objectives, we have to do it ourselves. So even when we have capable partners, sometimes they'll say, just step aside, right? We got this. Right? So when I was there in Afghanistan from 2009 to 11, we demanded basically, I was kind of pushing on an open door a bit, but we let the Brits off the hook. Right? We said, we got RC South, Regional Command South. We got it now. They had it before. But when we had our surge and we had more troops coming in, I said, we need to be in control of this really important area. What, in fact, that did was take away the British need to have a 2-star operational command, a division command that could be deployed and ready and practiced for other missions. It can't only be us, the United States, having the ability to have a 2-star and 3-star level commands that are really the organizing units of the fights that we're in. Right? So we lost that, and they lost that. And I remember at the time telling General Rodriguez, we cannot allow this to happen. There are greater things at stake. This isn't going to make any difference. We're going to have Americans everywhere anyway. We put Americans everywhere. Americans are with the Germans, with the Italians, with the Turks. Turks are a tremendous asset in Kabul. Tremendous asset. Well, we can't even talk to each other. They don't speak English. Everybody else does speak English when they come. They do not speak English, but they're Muslim country predominantly and are of tremendous value with their intelligence, and we don't even reap it because we can't talk to them, and it's too much of a pain in the neck to go through interpreters all the time. So we can get more out of these. Anyway, I'm going to leave this where I started. These things adapt over time and should. They work for us largely, I think, maybe. Our ability to pursue our national policies and in our own national interest does demand that we take a look at both the burdens and commitments we incur as being part of these alliances, as well as the benefits that we get from it. And it's a topic that isn't going to go away. I think we're going to maybe hear a little bit more about it in the future, even if a Democrat president is to become a president.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.